So I wanted to touch upon the three things that our education system in the West completely fails to educate kids and teenagers, not to mention adults, about. And these three things are very important in every single person's life. And it just puzzles me, why are these topics not discussed despite throwing billions and billions into education, and just completely avoiding these topics. Now, the two easy ones is health, and with health, I mean in a holistic sense, in terms of nutrition, exercise, and otherwise taking care of yourself physically. Because essentially, we have not discovered a way to extract the mind from the body. So you only have one body, and you need to work with that. If you're not in good health, you're done. I mean, life barely has a lot of meaning if your health is down the drain. So why is it that in primary, secondary, tertiary education, kids are not taught what is good nutrition? How does exercise influence life? What does it mean if you do a lot of, let's say, smoking, drinking, drugs? And how does that affect your short, medium, or long-term health? Why are these not discussed? Now, the easy part is this information is available everywhere. If you're interested, the internet is full of it. So you can discover that. That's not hard. I mean, if your IQ is higher than your shoe size, right? You can find out, and by the time you hit like teenage years, you know what's healthy, what's not. Um, but I would suspect that ignorance is not really the problem when it comes to health. The problem is people do know and they have access to the information, but their problem is they lack discipline. It's like when you know what you should do, but you still don't do it. That means you don't really have a spine, and then you just have a bunch of excuses of like, oh, I'm too stressed, I'm too busy, I'm this and that and the other. So it just shows a lack of discipline. Like, what do you prioritize in life? The short-term pleasure of eating something that tastes good, but long-term is gonna be detrimental to your health. Not going to the gym or not exercising because it provides a level of discomfort in the short term, although long term it's a great investment. So that's number one. That's a super easy in the grand scheme of things. Health. Number two, personal finances. They've done studies recently in the US and in the West in general that you have anywhere from half to two-thirds of the population that are basically living hand to mouth. They don't have savings. Something goes wrong, their car breaks down, they need to buy a new laundry machine, whatever. They just can't cut it anymore. So why is it that this is not taught in schools? And so many people have got a really bad grasp on their personal finances, despite that being extremely important in the long term. And the majority of people, if you ask them like, what would you do if you won the lottery, right? They would say, oh, I would get a bigger house, I would get a nicer car, I would go on holidays, etc. So the attitudes that people have are kind of twisted because essentially what you need to do, and this, I mean, one of the best books on the topic is Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad, is you need to start to understand that there are things called assets and then there are things called liabilities. What you do if you have a promotion at work, you get more money. Most people start spending that money. And if they lose that job, they have a bigger house, they have more cars, they have nicer cars, more insurance costs, etc., etc. So their whole life breaks down. Instead of thinking that I first and foremost I need to develop assets. Assets that will generate cash flow and appreciate in value in the short, medium, or long term. And through that cash flow and value appreciation of those assets, that will give you a backing in terms of finances in life. So if you do essentially lose a job, which is a job is besides being just over broke, a job is you selling your time against money, right? So that's not really something that most people want to do long term. But if you all the time you're focusing since you're a kid, all the money that you make, you build assets, then those assets and that value appreciation and cash flow, that will generate income in time that will support you. But if the only thing you do is you work for money and then you advance your career, doesn't matter if you make 100, 150, 200, 250,000 a year. But if every time you get more money, it means you get a bigger mortgage, a bigger house, a nicer car, two, three cars, a summer house, skiing lodge, and then you go on fancy vacations and you go to restaurants, high-end restaurants, and you buy clothes. You're like, oh, now I'm living the life. But then, boom, your job is you get fired or the company goes bust. What do you have left? And then suddenly you become a distressed seller. What do you have? You have a boat that you need to sell and you're distressed. Of course, you're going to sell it for a discount. So, but this information as well, it's all available on the internet. But you ask a random person, they haven't done the work, they haven't looked things up, they don't understand how money works. And that's why we have so many people who are barely over being broke. And with broke, I don't mean people generally think their house or their apartment is an asset. So you should rather buy than rent long term. And I'm not saying that's not correct. But if buying a house in and of itself is your goal, maybe it's not the best goal because it becomes an asset when you buy it at a location and you do the work and thinking, when I buy this, in time it will appreciate in value. Then it becomes an asset because everybody has to live somewhere. But if you just, buy land and build your dream house, you spend a shit ton of money on it, and then you want to sell it 10, 20, 30 years down the line, and you're not even getting the money that you invested. Not to mention the interest in the meantime. That's not an asset. That's a liability. So when you approach things like where you live, you first think, how can I make money for me long term? That should be the approach, but very rarely it is. And it's unfortunate because this is personal finance and health. Those are the easy parts, but people lack. I mean, when personal finance is sure part of it is ignorance, and the other part is equally, it's lack of discipline. It's like, oh, I want a house like this, I want to live like that, instead of thinking, I will not prioritize my personal desires and needs or wants, but I'll approach it first and foremost as an investment. And if I have enough money, it's a good investment. And then secondary goal is I want to enjoy and I want to, get my needs met. Um, and I would say this sort of an approach for assets and personal finances, I think more men in general are thinking this way, and to a lesser degree, women, because men generally have the burden of performance. Like women like guys who've built up their assets, they own their house, they've got a portfolio. But women think, well, I don't necessarily need to do that because I want a guy who's taking care of that. Which means that guys cannot develop this unless they're willing to compromise. Guys don't just wake up one day and say, oh, I've got a house that's mortgage free and I've got a portfolio of a 5, 6, 7 figures. It just doesn't happen like that unless you're born with the right name and family. So you always have to kind of cut back on your personal desires in order to build that asset base. But unfortunately, that is an issue for a lot of people. Now, the third part, which is not taught in education, and I find this to be probably the most detrimental, but also the solution is the most difficult. It's the most multifaceted, and extremely few people get it right, unfortunately. And that is who you're going to pair up with in life. What sort of, well, besides friends is one thing, but the partner in life that you're going to have, or the partners, which is more the term and the common kind of the common way of living nowadays. So for a lot of guys across the board, most guys, they will partner up, they will pair up with a girl that is just the best potential girl that's willing to drop their panties. And the guy's like, oh, I'm gonna shack up with her because now I'm getting a regular, source of sex. And outside of that, I mean, especially if the guy is pairing up when they're 20, 25, they're immature to a great extent, and they are full of testosterone. So the one thing that they are after is that she's hot and she's willing to provide sex for me, right? So that is a problem if the guy is coming from a, let's say, a normal background. Because I would say there's a very small percentage of people who come from so-called optimal childhoods and backgrounds where they have a two-parent household with healthy gender norms and a, let's say, a good father and a good mother, and their relationship functions. So that's a good example of how they perceive a quality relationship to be. Very few people have that. I mean, look at the single parent house, well, single mother households, divorces, and just rather toxic marriages, relationships of parents, and the kids see that as their first example of what should a relationship between adults be. And the awareness that their parents have is very low generally. And then the kid goes out at 18, 20, 22, 25, they pair up with somebody, or maybe even 30, but they're fully ignorant of what is the driver behind. For guys, it's a lot of times testosterone and just kind of clinching a girl who's ready to provide sex long term. It's that easy. A lot of women just don't get it. It's that easy for men. And because a lot of men are not in the top tier, they'll settle, right? That's why you see a good, decent guy who's got his life together and he's with a woman that's below average by all standards. And for women, the way they kind of pick out the guy, naturally they want to get the best deal they could possibly get, and that's fine. Um, but then why is it that a lot of these women, the quality guys generally, they either cannot get long term, or they think these guys are above them, or they have this party phase of when they're like late teens to in their 20s, they're like, oh, now I can get the hot guy, but I either can't lock him down or I'm not interested in locking the guy down. So they also make suboptimal choices. And also, let's say that the girl had a not great dad, or maybe the dad wasn't around, or maybe the dad was a complete wimp. So that's kind of giving the role model of what a man should be like. And a lot of times it's like she'll ultimately go either for a man that's very similar to her dad or the opposite, or lacking a father figure at all, she might go for the bad boys until she, hits the wall, and then it's like, oh my God, I need security. And yeah, but she's never really looking at a man saying, I want to be with this man for the rest of my life. She might do the deeds, wedding, marriage, all of that. But in the back of her head, she's like, it's good for now. But if he doesn't perform, I'll move on. So the problem of who do you pair up with, no educational institution is touching upon it because it's sensitive as a topic. But if you make the wrong choice and you pair up with the wrong person and you have to get kids with them or you get married, that could ruin your life. And yeah, why is it that these things are not taught in school? Just the basics of self-awareness, to understand where do you come from, who you are, what your role models were, what the value base is that you've been given from your childhood. But most people just they're completely ignorant about this. And then they go and they meet somebody, but they don't realize like they always have got a certain color, a certain filter in front of them when they see somebody as attractive or somebody who's not attractive. And the lack of awareness means that you're half blind going into relationships and having kids, which could impact the rest of your life. And maybe even an outsider is gonna see, the forest from the trees. But they are like, they're taking that relationship so seriously. Maybe I should not tell them, like that's a mistake. I see that's a mistake. And then, yeah, how much misery does that actually create in life? Because you make an ignorant choice of partner, you got kids, and then you pour in those problems on those kids. So you're kind of passing on the all the shite that you got from your own childhood, and you don't take accountability, you don't do the work, you don't educate yourself, you don't understand, like, okay, where did I come from, why am I like this? So I mean, this is The most difficult part of it, like personal finances and health, that's easy. You go online, you read up on it, and then you make a plan, you implement the plan, you get in touch with people who know about it. But when it comes to relationships, it's more difficult because you should start to become aware of yourself. You should learn about yourself. You need to understand psychology to a level, and you need to start asking the difficult questions. If you're unaware of yourself and who you are, what you represent, what your value base is, it's impossible to read other people. But when you've done the work for yourself, then reading other people becomes quite easy actually. Um, but yeah, how many people do realize who they are and what potential mistakes they've made when they're 30, 35, 40, 45, 50? And when their belief system, which is based on, hot air perhaps, maybe your partner leaves when you're 45 and you got kids and your whole world kind of crashes down. Who knows? Um, it just goes to show that why is my point so relevant is look at people who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s. How many of them are either divorced or they're in not so great relationships? And you might say, why is that? Nobody's putting a gun to your head saying you have to be with that person. If you're in an unhappy marriage, unhappy life, unhappy family as an adult, that's your choice. You need to own up to it. And a lot of people then, when they're 30s, 40s, they're like, oh man, I wish I knew. Then I would have done A, B, and C. I would have done things differently. So that's um that's something I would hope for in the future, that the politicians and public officials and the education system would touch upon these topics. I'm not saying they should tell you what to do, but they should raise awareness of, 1 plus 1 is 2, so that people understand that. Because if your parents, or well, if you don't have parents, you're an orphan, nobody's going to tell you this. So if the education system is not even raising a certain level of awareness, how the hell are you going to find out? If you just don't naturally have a proclivity and a tendency to be curious and look for these things online. So, anyways, um, that's my thoughts for today. And for those who are wondering, I cut my own hair. I've done it for 5, 6 years. Why, you might ask? Two reasons. Number one, it's a skill. I wanted to learn a new skill that I'm going to potentially use for the rest of my life. Number two, you go to a barber shop 10 times a year. What is that going to be? One visit, 30 euros? It's 300 euros. I can do something else with that money too. So look for these cues in life, like small things. Let's say cooking, for example. You want to go to a restaurant or you want to cook yourself. Cooking is a skill. Learn how to cook. Learn how to cut your hair. Learn these things. Are they pleasant? Maybe, maybe not. But those are skills. If you have a lot of these small skills, you can make your life more interesting, you can make it better, plus you can save money and then you can invest that money. So, anyways, have a good one, guys.